Reassembly of the high-output Quad 4 begins with the main bearing cap bolts. The number 1 main cap bolt is covered by the right side rail. This bolt has a torque angle specification. In order to access the number 1 main cap bolt with the torque angle meter, loosen the engine mounts and lift the engine with an engine support fixture. Reassembling the pistons begins with close inspection of the piston, especially the pin boss area and ring lands. Inspect these areas for deposits and wear. The upper compression ring has a square cut design. The lower compression ring has a beveled inside diameter. Be certain that the manufacturing mark is on the top of the ring. The oil control ring has an upper rail, a center expander, and a lower rail. The connecting rod cap nuts can be reinstalled next. As was the case with the main bearing bolt, the number 1 rod cap nut is covered by the right side rail. To gain access for the torque angle meter, the engine must be lifted. The flywheel to crankshaft bolts must be installed using a special procedure. Start by using an M10 by 1 tap to clean the threads in the crankshaft. And use a wire wheel to clean foreign material from the bolts. Then, with a Loctite thread locking kit, apply the adhesive primer to the crankshaft and bolt threads and wait 5 minutes. Next, apply the thread locking adhesive. Within 3 minutes, assemble the fasteners and torque angle them to specification. It may be necessary to remove the chamfer from the edge of an 18mm socket to get full socket engagement on the thin heads of the flywheel bolts. Reinstall the transaxle assembly according to service manual procedure. The cylinder head gasket must be installed without any sealer. Clean all gasket surfaces. Use only a plastic or wooden scraper to avoid damage to aluminum sealing surfaces. Carefully position the cylinder head on the gasket to avoid damaging the gasket. The cylinder head bolts must be wire brushed and lubricated with engine oil before they are reinstalled. Unlike early design torque-to-yield bolts, these head bolts can be reused. These bolts must be tightened in sequence to a torque angle specification. The shorter number 7 and 9 bolts have a different torque angle specification than the other longer bolts. Be sure to check the service manuals and service bulletins for the correct specifications. Here is the tightening sequence for the cylinder head bolts. The camshaft housing can now be reinstalled. Start with a new camshaft housing gasket and then the housing itself. The high-output Quad 4 lifters are different than most GM engines. The hydraulic lifters have oil feed holes toward the bottom of the assembly. If oil bleeds out of the lifter, air can enter it through the feed holes. The procedure to restore oil into the lifters is to allow the engine to warm up at idle for 5 minutes. Then increase engine speed to 2,000 RPM until the lifter noise is gone. Drop the engine speed back to idle for another 5 minutes, or better yet, road test the car to be certain the lifter noise is gone. Any lifters removed from the camshaft housing can now be reinstalled in their original position. If a camshaft is being replaced, all of its lifters must also be replaced. The next step is to lubricate the camshaft bearing journals and the lifters with GM camshaft pre-lube or equivalent. The camshaft must also be lubed before installation. The crankshaft must be positioned with the keyway at either 3 o'clock or 9 o'clock. This prevents the valves from contacting the pistons when the camshaft housing is tightened to the cylinder head. Orient the camshaft dowel pin at 12 o'clock to the cam housing. The camshaft can now be installed into the housing. Notice that the end of the intake camshaft has an extension to hold the power steering drive pulley. The exhaust camshaft has no extension. Clean the grooves in the cam housing and install new molded silicone seals. Pre-lube the bearing journals and put the cover on the housing and seat it. There are two different length bolts used to fasten the intake camshaft housing cover to the housing. Place the camshaft housing bolts in position and tighten them. There is a tightening sequence for the intake camshaft housing cover and the exhaust camshaft housing cover. Be sure to check for the correct torque angle specification before tightening. The procedure for installing the exhaust camshaft housing is similar to the intake housing. Two housing bolts hold the assembly in place during this procedure. Lubricate the seal with clean engine oil before installing it in the cam housing. Use an intake camshaft housing seal installer to drive the seal in place. Now the power steering drive pulley can be put back onto the intake camshaft. The power steering pump, bracket, and belt should be reassembled next. Leave the two adjustment bolts and the pivot bolt loose until proper tension is reached. Tension the belt with the adjustment stud. Then tighten the adjusting bolts and the pivot bolt. If a new belt is being installed, tension it to specification. Run the engine for 5 minutes, then retension it. The rear of the exhaust side camshaft housing is covered with the exhaust camshaft cover and end plate. This plate bolts to the rear of the exhaust camshaft housing. The gasket must be positioned with the imprinted sealer toward the camshaft housing. The timing chain housing can now be reassembled. Install the appropriate gaskets before placing the housing in position. Install the 14 bolts that fasten the housing to the block and camshaft housing. The first components to go on are the camshaft drive sprockets. The procedure for installing the sprockets is to first make certain the crankshaft keyway is still at either 3 o'clock or 9 o'clock. Check that the camshaft dowel is at 12 o'clock to the cam housing. Install the camshaft sprockets onto the camshafts. Then, install and tighten the sprocket bolts to specification while holding the sprockets with a camshaft sprocket wrench. Rotate the camshaft sprockets and insert the camshaft timing alignment pins. When the procedure is complete, rotate the crankshaft back to 0 degrees top dead center to retime the engine. The chain can be positioned around the camshaft sprockets, then around the timing chain idler sprocket. Now, remove the alignment dowel pin from the intake camshaft sprocket. Rotate the intake camshaft sprocket counterclockwise. Slip the chain clockwise over the intake camshaft sprocket. This will remove the slack from between the two sprockets. If properly timed, the intake camshaft alignment dowel pin should slide in easily. If the dowel pin does not fully index, the camshafts are not timed correctly and the procedure must be repeated. The chain can now be positioned around the crankshaft sprocket. Leave the alignment dowel pins installed. Now raise the car. With the slack removed from the chain between the intake camshaft sprocket and the crankshaft sprocket, the timing marks on the crankshaft and the cylinder block should be aligned. If the marks are not aligned, turn the crankshaft sprocket 1 tooth forward or rearward. Then remove the slack and recheck the marks again.